Okay, so this is the kind of full title of my paper. So to begin, this is Hieronymus Bosch's 15th century painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, and it's kind of the philosophical object that I'm going to be thinking through tonight, using to sort of think through. So I think we'd agree it certainly ranks among the most famous in world history. But a little known fact about it is that it's a folding triptych. So it has an inverse, a painting on its exterior side. You can see it here, which is much less famous. And what's interesting about this triptych is that you have to unfold this exterior side to see the interior panels. And you can see where it splits there and how you have to kind of split it open and unfold it to see what we normally just consider the main part of the garden. So tonight I'm going to at least attempt to seriously consider the strange world this neglected inverse presents. It is, in my opinion, a primordial world of chaos, the primal world of pre-human creation. It's an archaic and barely formed world of strange shifting and twisted shapes, of rough, lumpen earth and ancient waters. This is a world without people, a world without us, held only in the gaze of the God who witnesses it, a God Bosch painted quite small in the left-hand corner of the triptych. The question is, how do we move from this primordial world, this world without us, to the unfolding history of the main painting, the profusion of life and human forms? It is only through the splitting, the violent wounding of this primordial world in the gaze of God and the viewer held together. It is only through this wounding gaze that things come to be. It is only through the splitting of the primordial world that the world of history unfolds, in this case, literally. In short, the garden intimates that the ground of being is the wound. So this idea of the wound is sort of my pet metaphysical theory, and I'm going to attempt to explicate it first through the juxtaposition of Heidegger and Boober, and then by looking at the Hegelian concept of recognition. In particular, I want to argue that Hegel's fully developed concept of recognition, namely the synthesis of conflict and love, allows us to bridge the distance between Boober and Heidegger and to address where each is lacking. Secondly, I want to argue that the form this bridge takes is my theology or philosophy of the wound, which could be understood, as we will see, as the Heideggerian open made relational. Okay, so before I launch into my criticism of Heidegger and the Heideggerian open, I want to explain briefly and to the best of my ability what I understand the Heideggerian open to be. Now, unfortunately, this isn't really an easy task because the concept's very complex and it's kind of Gnostic and mystical. And I also think that Heidegger circles around the concept in different places at different times using different languages. So there's a lot of nuance there. But, to simplify and kind of be reductive, the open or the clearing or the no thing is the precondition or ground for being and intelligibility as such. It's the space which must exist for language and meaning to be able to move and come together. To borrow from Kafka, it's the axe which shatters the frozen sea of being. Without this kind of primordial absence or ontological gap, we'd be stuck, frozen, in a completely static field of pure being, which would preclude the possibility of language and of meaning. Okay, so given that conception, Heidegger would indicate that there's no getting behind this open. And it's for kind of a simple reason. How can we make intelligible what lies behind intelligibility as such? How can we ever say what lies behind language as such? These questions indicate the basic point that you can never define nothing, because to define it, you'd have to say nothing is, etc., etc., and in so doing, you'd be begging the question. As Heidegger puts it in What is Metaphysics, quote, the question of the nothing deprives itself of its own object, end quote. But here, I'm kind of audaciously hoping that we could sort of kind of, in a way, get behind the open. We could, following Booberian instinct, at least make it relational. And that would be my concept of the wound, the open made relational. But we'll have to see if that works, if we can get there or not. Okay. So having established what the open is, we can get into Boober's criticism of Heidegger. So Paul Mendes-Flohr is a professor at the University of Chicago. He wrote this concise and quite good essay, Martin Boober and Martin Heidegger in Dialogue, which goes deep into Boober and Heidegger's fraught and complex relationship. It's a very interesting article, and which I'm going to rely on here. So his basic argument is that at the heart of the two thinkers' disagreements lay a different understanding of human spokenness in the German Gesprochenheit, that is, human language in dialogue. Mendes-Flor states that, quote, to Boober's mind, Heidegger's principal focus on the ontological structure of language neglects the intersubjective dimension of the spoken word, end quote. In other words, Heidegger, to some degree, reified language, setting it over and above lived human life and discourse. This, to me, implies that Heidegger remained too onto-theological for Boober's liking, that Boober saw Heidegger as abstracting an ideal of language away from the discourse act as an actual, embodied, always already social experience. So to get more into the meat of this criticism of Heidegger's take on language, I think, also implicates the Heideggerian open. In what way? Well, Mendes-Flor writes of Heidegger's view on language that, quote, to speak is to say something, that is, to point to the clearing or the life world in which one's being unfolds. Language, as saying, is a clearing of Da, end quote. So in other words, to kind of simplify, language and speaking are real to the extent that they refer back to and are dependent on the clearing or open. Spokenness is, for Heidegger, defined ontologically by the clearing. So we can see that Heidegger's emphasis on the clearing is actually the main reason why he kind of misses the mark from Buber's perspective. It's why he abstracts away from human spokenness as an event between actual and embodied speakers. It's because he's more interested in the open as a ground of human spokenness. So what can we say is Heidegger missing here? In Buber's conception, what Heidegger misses is precisely the true ontological basis of language, otherness. As he puts it, quote, the ontological basic presupposition of language is the otherness of one's partner in conversation, end quote. In ontologizing language, Heidegger forecloses alterity, and thus the possibility of a truly relational or ethical philosophy as Boober understands it. So my sort of attempt to further Boober on this is to ask, basically, why is Heidegger like this? To broaden Buber's criticism a bit, I would argue it's because Heidegger is kind of a dyed-in-the-wool romantic. In particular, his whole story about the open and the encounter of Dasein with the open, I think definitely evokes the sort of notion of the Kantian sublime and the romantic encounter with the Kantian sublime. It reminds me of this classic sort of stereotypical German romantic painting, Traveler Above a Sea of Mist. I'm sure you've all seen it. I put in this presentation all the same, because I do think it captures something about Heidegger's conception and how that differs from Buber's conception. In Heidegger's language, the sublime moment of encounter with the ineffable is, quote, the surpassing of beings as a whole is accomplished by Dasein in being held out into the nothing, end quote. This is definitely a movement of the alone returning to the alone, with not a lot of emphasis on the intersubjective, if at all. The whole point of the romantic experience of the sublime is basically that it's not a social experience; it's a solitary one. But more philosophically, Heidegger's romantic holds that his version of the ineffable, the open, lies behind language and spokenness, and hence behind the possibility of relation and sociality as such. So this I would argue is the ultimate basis for the dramatic break with Boober. Okay, so having criticized, here's the painting. But having criticized Heidegger from a Buberian perspective, I'm going to try and do the opposite, criticize Boober from a Heideggerian perspective, but I'm going to do it a little more tersely and speculatively because Heidegger seemed remiss to criticize Boober in the same explicit way Boober criticized Heidegger. We don't have that. So we're sort of traveling without a map, but I think the Heideggerian criticism would go something like this. Whereas from Buber's perspective, Heidegger foreclosed alterity and thus the social, Boober, from Heidegger's perspective, could be accused of foreclosing the open as a grounded possibility, as a source of the new and the novel. Well, what do I mean by this? Heidegger has his concept of the they self, or das Man, which to greatly simplify could be understood as a kind of existing social order of the world, the way we normally do things, our existing conventions and traditions. For Heidegger, we are always already falling out of authenticity into an inauthentic mode of being as absorbed in the they self. We get stuck in a repetitive and monotonous mode of life based on our deferral of our own projects and lose sight of the possibility that things can be otherwise. That is Dasein, being in the world. Our being is radically contingent. But this is precisely what is rediscovered in our encounter with the open, or, and to put it in another Heideggerian phrase, in our being towards death. In being towards death, we discover the open, and in the open and only in the open, we discover the possibility of the truly new, that there is a horizon of possibility beyond the they self. So here, Heidegger's move to abstract away from the lived reality of the social seems to have a positive value or purpose. It shows us that things could be otherwise. It shows us how we could live authentically. It discloses, in other words, possibility to us. In this sense, Boober seems unable to account for the new in the novel, that is, for the value of possibility over social facticity, to the same degree that Heidegger can. Okay, so we've established this kind of, admittedly, I would say, somewhat overstated and somewhat reductive and hyperbolic opposition between Boober and Heidegger. So to clarify, on the one hand, that Heidegger's position is a philosophy that forecloses alterity in the social, but discloses possibility. On the other hand, we have Boober, who forecloses the possibility of the new, but discloses the other in sociality. So how could we overcome that opposition? Well, I identified, or in my mind, I see Hegelian recognition as offering one sort of out to this issue. In other words, Hegelian recognition might kind of bridge the gap between Boober and Heidegger. So what is Hegelian recognition? Here I'm very indebted to Robert R. Williams' illuminating book, Recognition, Fichte, and Hegel on the Other. Williams sets out to argue that beyond common stereotypes of solipsism, German idealism, in fact, had a strong but generally unnoticed theme of intersubjectivity, and intersubjectivity expressed through the notion of recognition. So for Hegel in particular, I think the most famous sort of mode of recognition that most people would spring to most people's minds when they think about Hegel is the master-slave dialectic. To give a quick summary before we look at what I think is that sort of illuminating quote, excuse me. In the master-slave dialectic, Hegel presents a pivotal moment in the historical development of consciousness, a primordial encounter with another, only resolvable by a life and death conflict, whereby either the subject or the other wins and the loser is made servile. So out of this beginning in domination, conflict, and alienation, Hegel develops a theory of mutual recognition and ethical life through reconciliation. Thus, conflict, at least in one sense, lies at the basis of shared social life. As Williams puts it, quote, Hegel's advance on Fichte is that he sees that, given the ontological distance between individual subjects, recognition requires struggle and issues in tragic conflict, end quote. So this brings us to the quote. It's from Philosophy of Spirit, an 1804 text, Predative Phenomenology. And I think it kind of helps us get to the meat of what this encounter is all about. So I'm going to read this quote. Okay. Each must have from the other the knowledge of whether he, the first, is in absolute consciousness. Each must place himself into such a relation against the other that this will bring this to light, i.e. he must injure him. And each can only know of the other whether he is a totality if he threatens him to the point of death. And each proves for himself that he is such a totality for himself only if he faces up to death himself. If in his own case he stops short of death, he only proves to the other that he will accept the loss of part or the whole of his possessions, that he will risk a wound but not life itself. Then for the other he becomes immediately not a totality, he becomes a slave of the other. So in this encounter with the other, the subject or the individual, or however you want to, the I, however you want to put it, finds himself thrust into an inescapable conflict. So why is this? Well, both the subject and the other limit each other's previous conception of themselves as an absolute totality. Since two absolute totalities or consciousnesses cannot logically both exist at the same time. And as a result, in this conflict, for the first time, the subject must face death and limitation. Here, one individual will win and the other must lose, and it can't be any other way. As his text indicates, the loser will be injured, wounded, if not literally, psychologically or spiritually or internally, as having internalized a sense of limitation, as having, as Hegel puts it, risked the wound. So this is the origin of servile consciousness for Hegel. But more strongly, I think, it could also be understood for our purposes as the origin of the open. In particular, the relational open, since it is produced in an encounter with the other. So in internalizing the gaze of victorious other, the subject internalizes a sense of limitation and death. They produce in themselves the ontological gap or wound, which is a precondition for sociality, language, and meaning as we understand it. As Sartre puts it, quote, I recognize that I am as the other sees me, end quote. So here we see how the Heideggerian open could be produced through alterity, not at its expense. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Hegel is not presenting a kind of social origin or just so story about the beginnings of human society here, like maybe what you get from someone like Thomas Hobbes. Hegel rejects the Hobbesian supposition that individuals could or were ontologically prior to the social. As as Williams puts it, real individuals, as far as we know them, are already social, i.e. embedded within and dependent on a social matrix and context. Hegel's concern is with the meaning of the social, not with its genesis, end quote. Well, what does this mean? This means that Hegel is dedicated to an immanent critique of sociality. He's trying to avoid the dubious political ontology that social origin stories present. And this gets us to something very interesting, that in fact, the master-slave dialectic is an attempt on the part of Hegel to deconstruct precisely this kind of notion of atomized abstract individuality, to show how mastery or the individual possessing totality or absolute consciousness as a concept and as a mode of life inevitably exhausts and empties itself. The exact way he does this is too complex to go into here. This is the dialectic part of the master-slave dialectic, but it's important to recognize that that is what he's doing, and what he's not doing is presenting a social origin story. And so I think, and so in this way, he avoids the potential Booberian criticism that he's abstracting from lived social life and postulating an ontology, whether political or philosophical, from within that abstraction. In turn, it also means that his account of the master-slave dialectic and of recognition in general represents a philosophical explication of a kind of encounter that's kind of always already present in the lived fabric of social life. In other words, master-slave represents dimension of lived possibility in the same way I-thou does, as presently inchoately in all everyday social relations. So this brings us to the second mode of recognition, which is love. So Williams is keen to point out that Hegel offers this divergent mode of recognition in contradistinction to conflict. So love is the opposite of domination or mastery. It, quote, allows the other to be, it seeks the freedom of the other, end quote. In love, the subject finds themselves again in the other. As William puts it, love is a reciprocal recognition in which one is for self through the other and for other through being for self. To borrow a concept from the poetry of Louis Lebet, love presents us with the paradox of a kind of double life, to live between and in the lovers. To quote Hegel, for this other lives only in me, as I am present in myself only in him or her. So what's interesting about this mirror effect of love is that it kind of comes with the problem, because this mirroring effect presupposes division and conflict. As Williams argues, quote, love cannot be thought apart from conflict. As the principle of unity and reconciliation, love overcomes conflict and opposition, end quote. Without distance, love cannot occur. For Williams and for Hegel, this means the mode of recognition in love implies and presupposes the mode of recognition in conflict, i.e. the master-slave dialectic. But as we've talked about previously, for Hegel, the master-slave dialectic demonstrates how equally mastery or domination inevitably exhausts itself, setting the stage for the possibility of love. In this sense, love and conflict actually mutually imply and reinforce one another. They are entwined as the two moments that together form the full sense of Hegelian recognition. Moreover, they cannot be divorced from one another, as mutually and inchoately always already constructing the fabric of our lived social reality. Conflict gives way to love, and love presupposes a distance established by mastery and conflict. So, to review, where does that kind of leave us? Well, hopefully we've seen how the Hegelian account of recognition in its two modes does at least some work in bridging the gap between Boober and Heidegger. And what would this be? Well, it's that Hegelian recognition remains grounded in the social and the encounter with the other, and doesn't produce an abstract ontology, and that satisfies Boober's position. On the other hand, it explains how alterity might produce the open, or what I call the wound, and thus allows for the possibility of the new, satisfying Heidegger. So this leaves us kind of with the question of, does Hegelian recognition point us towards the open made fully relational? In other words, have we achieved my goal of getting to, my kind of pet concept of the wound? Well, in answering that question and in concluding, I'd like to return to the image of the inverse side of the garden, that, this kind of very mysterious image, I think. So what occurs in the folding and refolding of this painting, the splitting and reforming of the primordial world? This unfolding and refolding represents nothing less than the primal dynamic of gathering up or withdrawal or concealment versus pouring forth or kenosis or disclosure. These are movements of and from distance and identification, from the wounding distance of the other in mastery to the mutual exchange of otherness and love. In order to live the double life of love with another, we must set ourselves aside for the other, and the possibility of this movement, and of all movement, seems grounded in an eternal absence, a wound. All occurs through the gate of the wound, its place is border. To put it in Boober's terms, the wound is the meeting place where the I and the thou encounter one another. It is a space which allows for the possibility of their relation, of their movements towards and back from one another. To love, we must bear the wound. As Heidegger relates, quote, the nothing does not merely serve as a counter-concept of being, rather it belongs to their essential unfolding as such. The garden is unfolded and refolded, disclosed and foreclosed, and the possibility of both these movements, of unfolding love and foreclosing concealment, is the split, the wound, the seam which tears the world. By standing in this gap, and only by standing in this gap, we see what can and must be seen.